This is the Kreg Mortise Mate, and it is a much cheaper alternative to the Festool Domino for making loose tenon joinery. But the real question is if it's a domino killer. Now before we get rolling, Kreg did send me this to review, but that doesn't mean you're not going to get my honest opinion. In fact, there are a couple of things that I think they could do to improve this. And there's another way you can use this tool that I haven't heard anyone talk about. We'll get to it in a minute. All right, inside the box, you have your instructions, you have your adjustment handle, a dust shroud, you have a work table, and then the main body of the jig itself. You also have all the hardware so that you can put everything together, but one thing Kreg did that I think is a nice touch is they included a 6mm cutter right out of the gate, so that way you're not spending an extra $50 to $60 just so you can actually start cutting the mortises. This does not come with any tenons, so either plan on picking up a couple boxes or just make your own. They're not that difficult to make. So let's get to setting up the Mortise Mate. You have the work surface right here with 4 holes that are countersunk, and you're just going to attach it to the work surface of the Mortise Mate with the included screws. And then this handle can be put on either side for left or right hand use. We have a couple of different holes. These two are always going to be used, and then depending on if you're left-handed or right-handed, either one of these will be used. So since I'm right-handed, I'm going to set it up kind of like this. This little washer right here, it goes against the body of the jig, and then that arm slides right over it. This is called a shoulder screw. You've got this little portion right here, and that is going to fit perfectly inside the hole on this handle. If you're having trouble getting this to thread, it's because this is getting hung up on that surface. So it's got to kind of fit down in there before the threads will actually engage. And the final touch is that dust shroud, and we're ready to go. Stepping back for a minute, once this is all together, it seems to be really well made. The majority of the jig is metal, and the parts that are supposed to move operate nice and smoothly. But you may be thinking that this looks strangely similar to another product, and then jump to the conclusion that Kreg actually ripped off the Pocket Mill Pro by Jessom, which we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the reason that these two systems look so similar is because Kreg and Jessom actually collaborated on the development of the Mortise Mate. So put down the pitchforks and tomatoes, everything is fine. Before you can use the Mortise Mate, you first need to secure it to a workbench. Now, if you have dog holes in your workbench, you can use a dog hole clamp or T-track clamps, or if you don't have any of that fancy stuff, you can just use a regular old trigger clamp or F-style clamp on the side of your bench and lock it down. Now, if you want to go with a more permanent solution, you can use the 4 included screws and run them through these pre-drilled holes in the top of the work surface, but I didn't really want to do that, so I'm just going to clamp it in place. With that done, let's jump into some joinery. We're just going to start off with a simple butt joint. Yeah. It's hilarious. I'm gonna go ahead and mark my lines and get everything laid out. What I'm gonna do, rather than holding it here, I actually just slid this part of my ruler out to the right dimension. I'm gonna hold it against the side of my stock and make my mark. And then I'll do the same thing right here. That way I have a consistent distance, and now all I have to do is cut my mortises accurately, which is easy enough. For the best results with this kind of joinery, it's really important to make sure you keep the same side of your pieces facing up. And you'll see why here in just a minute. But here's a quick tip for you. When I'm in the midst of a project, it can be really easy to lose track of which side needs to be facing up. So I'll do one of a few things. I'll either draw an arrow so that I remember that that's the side that's supposed to be facing up. I'll either just write up, pretty self-explanatory, or for a quick visual cue, I'll just take a piece of blue painter's tape and I'll slap it on the side of my piece that's supposed to be facing up. I hope that helps for your next project. Now the next thing we need to do before we can start cutting our mortises is to set our height here on the back of the Mortise Mate. I'm taking it off the bench so that you can see it just a little bit easier, but usually if it's already locked down, you just leave it there. Now I'm either going to line up the middle of my piece with this mark on the jig, or I'm just going to look at the scale that's right here. This is not a 1/2 inch down from the center line. This is actually for 1/2 inch material, for 3/4 inch material, 1 inch, so on and so forth. All you do is you just set it to whatever your material thickness is and lock it down with this handle here in the back. One thing that's nice about this locking handle is if you run out of space, you can pick it up and rotate it, and then you have more room to keep moving it. In all honesty, cutting the mortise dead in the center of your stock is not super important, because as long as you're keeping track of which side is supposed to face up as you're going through your project, everything is going to come out just fine. But now that the height is set, we don't have to touch that for the rest of our project, assuming we're using the same thickness of material. And I can line up my piece with this center mark on the face of the jig and clamp it in place. When it comes to actually cutting the mortise, we have a couple of options. We can use the 6mm cutter that came with the mortise mate, but Kreg also sells 8 and 10mm cutters as well to use for larger projects, along with corresponding tenons in 6, 8, and 10mm sizes. So for now, we're just gonna go with the 6mm cutter and set our depth of cut with this collar, similar to how the pocket hole jigs are set up. Now, the way that you figure out what your depth of cut should be is usually just to divide the length of the tenon, which in this case we're using a 1.5 inch tenon, cut that in half for 3/4 of an inch, and that's marked right here on your cutter, and that's where you want the collar to be set. Now, there are some exceptions to this, but for a simple joint like we're doing right now, this is the rule we're going to follow. Another quick tip for you, whenever you're setting up a tool, be it the table saw to make dados, the router table to cut tongue and groove joinery, or something like this where you're cutting mortises, make sure to do some test cuts in scrap material, because your first cut will usually be off the mark just a little bit one way or another and require some adjustments. With my cutter set, I'm just going to grab my drill and chuck it up in here, and gonna take a little bit more care, not gonna fly through this like I usually would with a drill bit, because that is a router bit there on the end and it will cut you. So all right, so we got our first mortise cut. Let's go ahead and check the fit with one of these 6mm tenons from Kreg. First impression is the tenon goes in very easily. That is kind of a good thing, kind of not. There's a little bit of slop going up and down, and then obviously there's a lot of slop here in the side, but that's just because I haven't dialed in the width of that mortise slot yet. And I'm going to show you how to do that real quick and how you can keep track so that your mortise ends up being centered in the jig. Okay, so let's say that we want our mortise to be tighter than the full width, because maybe you need a little bit more alignment with the type of project that you're doing. You can do that with the mortise mate. It's a simple adjustment. You have a brass screw on the left and right side of the jig, and then on the very side you have a silver screw here and then a silver screw here on the other side. All we're gonna do is loosen this brass screw. That's our locking screw, and then we're gonna keep track of our number of turns, and we're gonna turn this screw in. So that's 1 full turn. That would be 2 full turns. We'll start there and then we will lock this down. And I'll repeat the process here on the other side. Now, my guess is that that's going to be too tight, but we'll check it here in a little bit. All right, with that clamped back down, I'll just grab my test piece and scooch it over a little bit, cut another mortise, and we'll compare the difference and see how tight it is. All right, I can already tell that is way too small. Let's just take a look, maybe compare it a little bit using my very accurate eyeball measurement. I think maybe I'm gonna back it out a half a turn on either side. That should probably get me where I wanna be. You wanna put your clamp actually not over here at the edge, but put it a little bit closer to where the force is actually being applied from the cutter. That will help to ensure that your piece stays nice and flat against the front of the jig. Still just a little bit tight, so we'll back it off the rest of the way, so I'll end up with only having tightened it 1 turn. Yeah, that's a lot better. It could still be snugged up just a touch, but really, it's just fine. One thing that I've heard from a couple of other folks is that you can get some flexion here in the jig, and that's true if you're pushing down on this handle. I get it, you've got the weight of the drill hanging off the side of the jig, but if you fight that tendency and just kind of hold the handle nice and loosely while you're moving it back and forth, and try to not let the weight of the drill hold the jig down. Not that big of a deal for the kind of joints that are being made here, but definitely something to keep in mind if you want to make the best possible cut.
Now that I have the width dialed in, I'm going to go ahead and cut the mortises in both pieces for this joint. And after every cut, I make sure to reset the depth on the jig, which is oddly satisfying. For me, this Bessie gear clamp worked better than a standard trigger clamp for holding stock right in front of the mortise mate while cutting into end grain. And as you can see, my bench is trying to take a tour of the shop because I forgot to lock down all the casters before I got started making my cuts.
So when we bring these pieces together, there's no force required to close this joint up. But what's nice is that the top is good and flush because we kept track of which side needed to be facing up when we were cutting our mortises. And just for quick demonstration, even though I did my best to line up the jig just right, if I flip it, I can feel that there's a little bit of a lip. It's minor, it would sand out without any issue, but just best practices, keeping track of that surface is what you want to do. Anyways, we have some slop side to side, which is totally normal for a loose tenon joint. In fact, I usually cut one side of my joints on the loose setting, cut the other side on the tight setting, so that way I have some wiggle room or some forgiveness while I'm bringing things together. The thing that is concerning is that there is a fair bit of twist in this mortise. And I don't think it's because the mortise was cut sloppy. I think it's because the tenon is undersized. So I have a couple of 8mm dominoes in the shop. I'm gonna recut these joints with an 8mm cutter, and we'll come back and we'll check it out. All right, so the domino, that fits good, exactly like I would expect a domino to fit. And the tenon, that's more snug than the domino was. That's kind of crazy. I did not expect that. Let's bring these two pieces together. Just a little bit of friction, exactly what you want. And yeah, these line up really well. So let's just test the fit with the domino. I mean, it should be exactly the same. And yeah, it is. They both fit great. The domino is surprisingly just a little bit more loose than the tenon from the Kreg Mortise mate is. I'm kind of thrown off here because I really didn't expect the 8mm tenon to fit as well as it does. I mean, it fits just as good, if not better, than the Festool domino in the same size. Now, I kind of wish that I had some 6mm dominoes to test in those 6mm mortises that I cut, but unfortunately I don't. It doesn't make sense why this fits so much better than the 6mm. I'm assuming, like, let's just face it, this is a new product release. Kreg might be dialing in some things, and maybe those 6mm tenons over time are gonna come in and be exactly the right size. But while we're at this, I'm gonna cut some 10mm mortises and we'll see how the fit is with those. All right, so I just cut a few with the 10mm and let's see, I've not done a test fit with this yet. We'll see. Yeah. That's quite snug. I could probably loosen the jig a little bit. I might not be able to get this one back apart. So let's make sure that everything is nice and tidy. Sometimes if you get a little bit of fuzz there on the surface of your mortises, just hit it with a sanding block real quick to knock that down. Make sure that I have everything lined up the right way. Yeah, this is on the money. You can see that is a good fit right there. That's very impressive. Oh yeah, that's impressive. So the 8mm and the 10mm are just dead on. There is no, I mean, there's a little bit of twisting in there, but I get that amount of twist with a Festool domino. That is really, really impressive. So the 10 and the 8mm tenons seem to be dialed in. The 6mm seems to have a fair bit of play in comparison to these. And, you know, I have the mortises set for both of these pieces to be just like dead on, no slop at all in the width. So if you need a little bit of adjustability, cut one size first and then dial it in and then cut the other size. So that way you have just a little bit of slop. Alrighty, I want to cut a couple of other joints and see how this performs. So let's get set up. Now we're gonna mock up another situation where I use loose tenon joinery pretty frequently, and that is for gluing up a tabletop. I like to use loose tenon joinery for aligning my boards, not necessarily side to side, but up to down, up to down, up and down. Anyways, so what we're gonna do first is just lay out our lines. Generally, I do something around 10 to 12 inches apart, but for this, we're just gonna do 3 mortises equidistant. We're it really doesn't matter all that much. The big thing that matters is that you keep the same side facing up. I'll cut all the tight joints right now because it's already set up that way, and then we'll open it up so that way we have that adjustability that loose tenon joinery is loved for. So let's get going.
Whoopsie daisy.
Well, that is what happens when you forget that you made a different cut just a little while ago. So yeah, check this out. This is what a mortise looks like when it comes through the top of your workpiece. Maybe let's just flip this board around. We'll pretend nobody noticed. Before I even put that on there, I'm gonna adjust the height setting. So my stock is about 1 inch. And just to show you how much it doesn't matter, I just eyeballed to the inch setting. Let's try this again. Okay, so we got our mortises cut, and what I always like to do is to actually go ahead and put the tenons into the tight slots first. You know, it's always a good sign when you have to hammer them in just a little bit. So, as you can see, these two are much closer together than these two are, and that just goes to show that the layout really doesn't matter all that much. So, let's see how well this does. Alrighty. Really nice and flush across the top, and there's no deflection that I can detect. I would absolutely be happy with that and feel comfortable using that as an alignment system for tabletops. Okay, so next let's do some miter joints. I've already cut these and planed the stock ahead of time. As you can see, there's just a little bit of a gap at the leading or trailing end of my cut, and that's because there's just a little bit of deflection in my particular miter saw. So we are going to put one tenon across right here at the base, and we'll see how it goes. To set up for a joint like this, what you want to do is bring your two pieces together. I'm sure that you could do a lot of math if you really wanted to, but I don't really want to. So I'm just going to take my 8mm tenon and I'm going to set it, you know, wherever it looks like I will have enough space, but you know, pretty much right there looks good. So I'm just going to eyeball the center of that and then scribe a line. Do that. Get my corners lined up, and I'm just going to do my best to make a mark that's right across from it, and then I will continue that line over here like so. And now we'll get this clamped and cut our mortises. Now make sure you always reset the jig, because if you just go plunging in there full depth, it gets a little squirrely. All right, mortise is cut, so now let's see what we got. Still got a good fit on that mortise as well. Oh yeah, that came together nicely. I don't dislike that at all. It looks like I didn't get it lined up perfectly. I don't know how persnickety y'all are, but for me, that would drive me a little crazy. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna make an adjustment to the jig. I'm gonna open up this one mortise just a little bit, and then we're gonna get it back together. You'll see how nice that little bit of adjustability can be with loose tenon joinery. Yeah, that opened up the mortise just ever so slightly. See if we have enough adjustability now. Yeah, that's looking good. So now our corners are nice and lined up. We had just enough slop so that I can slide the joint to be exactly where I want it to be. I want to try two joints that nobody else has tried yet, or at least not that I've seen, with the mortise mate. We did a mitered joint, right? But now I want to try an angled joint. Instead of it being like this, it's now going to be like that. Now you may think not a big deal. Well, it's not quite as easy, because now to make this cut, I have to set it up on the jig like this. So really all that means is I just need to cut a support block to clamp this to. So let's go do that real quick. Instead of trying to figure out what the height needs to be, I'm just gonna visually line up this center line with my line here on my piece. The jig doesn't have quite enough adjustability here in the height, so we might end up cutting through, but let's go ahead anyways. I just have the jig pulled all the way up, and with my piece in place, I'm gonna grab my support and just push it up as far as I can until it contacts. Since this is wanting to wedge and push the front of the jig away, I'm going to just use as little pressure as I think I can get away with. And who knows, this may not work at all, but let's go. Yeah, that's not gonna work. All right, so I was all pumped about that, thought it would work, and I think it will. You would just have to figure out a jig to mount to this to then hold your piece at an angle. Okay, so what was going on, as this piece is clamped, it's pushing down and flexing the face of the jig away. So the more clamping pressure I put on here, the more it's gonna flex this. I don't wanna damage the jig, and you're gonna end up not having a ton of clamping pressure on your workpiece. So that's why I don't think this is gonna work, but it would be cool.
I got an idea.
If you had a bigger base that was wider, right? And then you put some toggle clamps on there, I think you could lock this in place to your sled, if you will, or to your wedge, and then it might work. But anyways, we're gonna move on to something else that I've not seen anyone do yet. And who knows, maybe it'll end up like this. Figuring this out is really gonna bug me now. I have not seen anyone attempt to cut a mortise with the mortise mate into the face of a piece of plywood, but I'm gonna go ahead and lay things out. We're gonna cut our mortises in what will be the shelf, or what would be the shelf. It's pretty small for a bookcase, come to think of it. It's close enough. I'm not gonna make that same mistake again. Let's change the height. Okay, one thing to consider real quick is that our tenons are 1.5 inches long. So unless I want to trim these down, I need to change my depth of cut with the cutter. Now the collar on my bit only has a mark at 3/4 of an inch. So you know what? I'm gonna try and just measure, see if we can't get it to work. By the way, if you don't have one of these 6-inch pocket rules, there are tons of different brands. I got this one at a trade show. They're great to have. I keep one in my apron, which I'm not wearing right now, but get a 6-inch rule because it's a heck of a lot easier to balance than, you know, pulling out your tape measure and doing this. I don't know. I could do that, but I just find a 6-inch rule a little bit more welcoming. Oh, what do you know? The 8mm bit does have a 1-inch mark on it. So disregard what I just said, but don't disregard the 6-inch rule. It's a good thing. All right, so we cut our mortises into the edge of a piece of plywood. Amazing. What I'm really curious about is if my idea is gonna work or if it's gonna be a big old flop. So my very highly advanced blue tape must go. This is invigorating, isn't it? Watching somebody take tape off of something. What we're gonna do is not in the manual, but we're gonna do it anyways. So remember our locking knob over here? Instead of wasting your life doing this until the thing is all the way out, we can take the 3mm Allen wrench and you're gonna pull up on the handle so that it disengages from the spring that's in there. You can hear it clicking, and just back this screw out and everything's gonna kind of fall apart. Don't worry, it won't be that big of a deal. Yeah, just like that, it's gonna fall apart a little bit. Okay, so now what you have is you have the main body of the mortise mate without this L bracket. I wouldn't recommend throwing this away. It's still very helpful. Now, one thing to consider is this dust port. If you look, it is slightly proud of the surface, okay? So we're gonna take that dust port off as well. We don't have to take all of this off, we just have to take off this little adapter that we put on when we first assembled the thing. So 2 screws, undo those. Didn't even drop them. How about that? Okay, so now the main portion of our mortise mate will sit nice and flat on a panel. You probably see where we're going with this because you're smart. All right, so we're gonna reset our depth and we're going to change the position of our collar here from the 1-inch mark to the 1/2 inch mark, because, you know, 1 plus 1.5 equals 1.5, and that's the length of our mortises. So, or that's the length of our tenons. Words are hard. Words are really hard sometimes. With a piece clamped here along the bottom, I basically have a reference surface where I can slide this way or that way, and all of these mortises are going to be parallel with one another. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but this is my pencil line right here. And I'm basically just using this as a window to help me align it. Since this is slightly looser right now, I'm not terribly worried if I'm dead on in the middle, but we'll see if I should have been worried. Now, we just need to get this clamped down. I've done this before, don't judge me. You know, in a pinch, you can use a stack of dominoes or tenons or whatever these are called. We will just set these right here to act as a spacer. Oh yeah. We have a little bit of tear out here on this, well, not a little bit. We have a fair bit of tear out here on the surface. To be honest, this is some of the cheapest plywood I've ever used. So I'm not surprised at all that it tore out, but that should be covered by our shelf. Just gonna give that a quick sand. I might even just cut it with a razor blade. I guess it's the moment of truth. Let's see what we got. All right, yeah, that is awesome. So check that out. Very good, very good. I'm really happy with that. A little proof of concept, it is not a primary function of the mortise mate, but as you can see, it can be done. So here's what I would do if, you know, I was wanting to use this to make lots of mortises in a panel. I would get an extra piece of plywood and I would trace this profile on it and I would cut it out. So that way I can set this into my piece of plywood. I might even get fancy and have some arms or some tabs or something that come over and hold this down in place. But you know, another idea, if you didn't want to make a dock, so to speak, for the mortise mate, you could just have a straight edge, follow me, with a piece of T-track and then some toggle clamps to then, you know, move along the track and hold the mortise mate down at each one of the locations. The only thing you'd have to clamp in place would be your rail on your board. I don't know, sounds like a good idea. All right, so if you do venture into taking the mortise mate off of the base and off of this L bracket, it can be a touch fiddly to get everything put back together, but I'll show you the easiest way I've found to do this. So you have a couple of locating tabs right there, and they run in these slots here on the left and right of the main body of the mortise mate. Just go ahead and line those things up like so. Don't forget the washer, slide that over there. Now, this handle, start it at the far side, and then you're gonna only be able to make about 3/4 of one revolution to tighten that. And as you can see, it's gonna be really, really loose and wiggly woggly. So what you're going to do is you're gonna take the handle, pull it away from the body, and then you're just gonna use your same Allen wrench and just go ahead and tighten it down while you're holding the handle out. So that way it's keeping that spring, or the spring's not disengaged, there's a little spline in there that is allowing you to turn the handle and tighten things down. So with that turned all the way in, and as you can see, you can now raise and lower the mortise mate to adjust your height, and it's just like it was before I convinced you to take it apart. So what do I think? So we've cut a few different test joints, and after a little bit of practice and fine tuning, the joinery cut with the mortise mate is pretty good. Now those 6mm tenons were a little bit on the loose side. The 8 and 10mm tenons seem to be just fine. So maybe there's still a little bit of fine tuning that Kreg is doing to work out those kinks. But in the meantime, if you need 6mm tenons, either try the Festool Domino tenons or maybe consider making your own stock. Now, since there are other ways to cut mortise and tenon joints, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of some of those alternatives. The first two alternatives actually aren't even mortise and tenon jigs or joints, but actually dowels. Dowels are fast and a strong alternative to loose tenon joinery. But that said, my main gripe with them is that unless you're using multiple dowels, your piece can rotate, and if you are using multiple dowels, then you have absolutely zero room for error when it comes to lining things up. That said, if you are interested in trying out dowel joinery, the jig I've heard the best things about is actually the Dowel Max. This jig allows you to drill into the edge of stock for rail and style type construction, as well as into the middle of boards so you can make shelves and whatnot out of plywood. Now, I haven't personally used this jig, but at a price of $250, I'd probably just go with a mortise mate and call it a day. The bead lock system from Rockler is another alternative, and it's a neat solution to the shortcomings of dowels in that you can use a single bead lock without the rotational issues you have with dowels. You only need a drill to cut the joint, and this jig is about 90 bucks. That said, you still have very little wiggle room when it comes to laying out your joinery, so if you're off a little bit, things aren't going to go together very well. You're also limited to only working on the edges or ends of your boards with this jig. As far as I can tell, you can't use it in the middle of a board. But if I'm wrong about that, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you already have a plunge router in your shop, kind of like this one, it's going to be the cheapest way to cut mortise and tenon or loose tenon joints for your project. Now, if you have an edge guide you can just throw on, you can more or less freehand your cuts, but for a little bit more repeatability, you can use a template along with a guide bushing set. And when it comes time to cut mortise and tenons on your end grain though, you're likely going to need to make another set of jigs to hold the piece securely and safely, so that way you have a little bit more of a platform to cut your tenon or your mortise with. Either approach you take with a hand router is going to require accurate layout for good results, and the process is going to be much slower than some of the other options we'll be discussing. The closest comparison to the mortise mate is the Justin Pocket Mill Pro, which I mentioned earlier. It's roughly $50 more than a mortise mate, and it does have a built-in solution for cutting mortises on angled surfaces. While I don't have any personal experience with the Pocket Mill Pro, from what I can tell, it and the mortise mate both function very similarly. And my buddy John over at Lincoln Street Woodworks did a great review a while back on the Pocket Mill Pro. So if you're interested in that, go and check out his video. Now, the most popular alternative to the mortise mate that comes to mind is going to be the Domino. There are two different versions of this tool that people love to hate: the DF500, which is the standard size, or the DF700, which basically just means it's bigger. These are both great at making loose tenon joinery quickly and in a variety of positions. Their main selling point is speed, versatility, and precision. However, that all comes at a price of around $1,200 to $1,700, which means they're out of reach for most hobbyists to intermediate level woodworkers. In all honesty, it wasn't until I actually started doing custom woodworking full time that I finally shelled out the money for a Domino, and even then, I bought mine used. But aside from the price, the other drawback to a Domino can be working on small stock. And I'm really nitpicking here because with the use of a docking station like these from Ramon, working on smaller pieces can be managed fairly easily. Now, one other thing that I'll say about the Domino is that sometimes it's really handy to be able to take the tool to the project. For instance, when you're working on a tabletop, you have 8-foot boards, it's going to be a lot easier to take this Domino and go down the length of your board than to have the mortise mate clamped to your workbench and be lugging the board across the jig. Now, if you were working on long boards like that, I would absolutely screw this jig down to your workbench, but for the test that I was doing, it made sense just to clamp it in place. At this point, we have checked out a handful of options for making loose tenon joints. So if you're interested in any of the products that I mentioned in the video, there are affiliate links in the description, the pinned comment, and the shop button. Also, I just want to say thanks real quick. Your support through comments and subscribing not only means a lot and motivates me to keep going, but any purchases made through affiliate links, even though I know they can get a little bit annoying, it does help to keep the lights on. And for that, I'm truly grateful. So thank you. So who's most likely to use this? Well, a full-time lumber slinging custom woodworker is likely to opt for one of the more expensive tools simply because they're faster. I really think that the mortise mate is a great solution for those looking to level up their woodworking skills and add something like loose tenon joinery to their projects without having to spend a ton of money. But I want to hear from you. What do you think about the mortise mate? Are you more inclined to go with this or one of the other options? Thanks a lot. Y'all have a great day.